This week we'll look at the Atlantic slave trade between roughly 1500 and 1800. It was during this period that European countries looked to Africa as a source of labor for the massive plantations they established in the Western Hemisphere, the so-called New World. Apart from the devastating impact it had on the African peoples, the Atlantic slave trade is crucial to understanding the growing interdependence among countries around the world after the 1500s, the beginning of what we now understand as modern globalization. The Atlantic slave trade, otherwise known as the triangular trade, involved three different continents: the Americas, Europe, and Africa. However, the foundations of slave trading in Africa are not exactly European. The slave trade in Africa would actually take off in the 7th century with the expansion of the Islamic empires. Camel caravans and ships transported captured sub-Saharan Africans to areas across the Mediterranean, but especially to India and other parts of Asia. By the time the Europeans arrived looking for slaves in Africa in the 1400s, the Muslim empires had already extracted an estimated 10 million Africans to the Middle East and Asia. The Portuguese would be the first Europeans to land in Africa looking for slaves. The first encounter took place in 1441, when a Portuguese raiding party succeeded in capturing 12 African men. By 1460, the Portuguese were dealing directly with local tribes that captured the slaves for them and were exporting about 500 slaves a year to Portugal and Spain. Initially, these slaves worked as miners, porters, and domestic servants. But as Portugal expanded its dominions to the Atlantic islands and Brazil, slaves began to be used for agricultural work, especially after the establishment of sugar plantations in mainland Brazil. In the early 1500s, the Spanish became interested in African slave labor, once the diseases they had unknowingly brought to the Americas, including syphilis, smallpox, measles, mumps, among others. These diseases began to ravage the indigenous populations of their new empire. And because the natives lacked previous exposure, they exhibited little immunity. So the conquerors found themselves in possession of vast parcels of land, very large plantations, with no or very few laborers to work them. In addition, after 1542, the Spanish crown declared all Native Americans subjects of the Spanish king, a decree that made their enslavement illegal. So, although now officially Spanish, the Native Americans continued to work as indentured servants under the encomienda system, which forced them to work for their captors in exchange for a Christian education. But the encomienda system didn't prohibit the enslavement of those who weren't Spanish. So the Spanish quickly turned to purchase African slaves, the cheapest and closest source of labor outside the Americas. To the north of the Spanish settlements, the English colonists became quite interested in slave labor as well. From the beginning of the 17th century all the way through to the 19th century, the English first, but then the Americans became important clients of the slave trade. In part 2 of this week's lecture, we'll continue our examination of the slave trade. We'll revisit the triangular trade routes. We'll take a deeper look at the so-called Middle Passage. We'll look at the impact of the Atlantic slave trade both on the Americas and Africa. And finally, we'll take a look at the legacy of slavery.